Imagine living in a picturesque, quiet town where everyone knows each other and trust runs deep. A place where the appearance of normality is rarely questioned. Now, picture this: behind one of those charming, ordinary homes, behind its walls, an unimaginable horror was unfolding, hidden for over 2 decades. This isn't the story of a criminal you'd spot in a crowd. This is the story of a man who wore the perfect mask, a trusted father, a respected engineer, a man named Josef Fritzl. But beneath this seemingly impeccable exterior was a monstrous reality. The same hands that built a life of normality also built a prison beneath his home, imprisoning his own daughter for 24 years. This was a secret so dark, so hidden, that no one, not even his closest family, suspected the nightmare that festered just below their feet. This is the case of Josef Fritzl and how the peaceful streets of Amstetten, Austria, would forever be stained by the atrocities that were concealed behind its most deceptive facade. On a seemingly ordinary day in 1984, a young woman named Elisabeth Fritzl, barely 18 years old, vanished from the quiet streets of Amstetten without a trace. She had dreams, ambitions, and plans like any other teenager, but those dreams would never be realized. Her disappearance was sudden, unexplained, and as panic set in, her family began searching for answers. But Josef Fritzl, the man everyone trusted, her own father, was quick to offer an explanation that would halt any suspicions. He presented a letter allegedly written by Elizabeth, claiming that she had run away to join a cult, seeking a different life away from her family. The words in that letter, crafted by Joseph himself, painted the picture of a rebellious daughter breaking away from the life she knew. He convinced his wife, Rosemary, and the authorities that Elizabeth had willingly left them. Days turned into weeks and then into years, with the family resigning themselves to the idea that Elizabeth was gone by her own choice. But behind this carefully orchestrated lie was a truth far more sinister. Elizabeth hadn't run away, she had been dragged into the very depths of her father's monstrous plan. Hidden from the world, cut off from her family, her fate was sealed in the darkness of the secret dungeon Joseph had constructed beneath their own home. In the days and weeks that followed Elizabeth's sudden disappearance, her family was consumed by fear and confusion. Rosemary Fritzl, her mother, was devastated, her heart aching with the unbearable thought that her daughter was gone. She couldn't reconcile the idea that Elizabeth would simply vanish without a word, no explanation, no goodbye. Rosemary, desperate for answers, searched everywhere she could. She reached out to Elizabeth's friends, visited places her daughter frequented, and begged for help from anyone who might know something. The police were involved, but their efforts were hindered by the letter Joseph presented, the one supposedly written by Elizabeth herself. It painted a picture of a girl who had grown distant, who wanted nothing more to do with her family, and who had chosen a new life in a cult. Joseph stood firm, reassuring everyone that Elizabeth had made her own choice, that she wasn't coming back. As time passed, Rosemary's hope began to fade. She felt an unbearable weight as a mother torn between clinging to the hope that her daughter might return and slowly accepting the devastating possibility that Elizabeth had abandoned them. Eventually, the search dwindled as both the family and the police came to believe Joseph's story. The heartbreak was immense, especially for Rosemary, who couldn't understand why her daughter would leave without a trace. What she didn't know was that Joseph had used his position of trust, his role as a husband and father, to hide the horrific truth. The real tragedy wasn't that Elizabeth had abandoned her family. It was that she was suffering in silence, trapped just meters away in the very house Rosemary still called home. Long before the day he locked his daughter away, Josef Fritzl was carefully orchestrating a dark plan that would allow him to control Elizabeth in the most sinister way imaginable. Years before her disappearance in 1984, Fritzl began the construction of a secret space beneath his home, a place that would become Elizabeth's prison. This was no ordinary basement. Fritzl, an experienced engineer, meticulously designed and built a hidden dungeon that was virtually undetectable from the outside world. He dug deep beneath the foundations of his home, creating a series of rooms with reinforced concrete walls and a steel door, the kind used in bank vaults. The dungeon was a maze of tight, suffocating spaces, sealed off from any light or sound from the outside world. It was a place meant to trap its victims completely psychologically and physically. To ensure the secrecy of his plan, Fritzl applied for permits under the guise of building a simple storage area. His background as an engineer meant he knew exactly how to make the modifications undetectable. The basement was hidden behind multiple layers of deception. Thick walls, a soundproof structure, and a concealed entrance disguised behind a heavy bookshelf. Even his own family, who lived just above the dungeon for years, never suspected a thing. Inside this nightmarish prison, Elizabeth's life would soon become a reality of darkness and isolation. The dungeon, consisting of a few cramped rooms, had barely enough space for basic necessities. There was a small bathroom, a rudimentary kitchen area, and a sleeping space. No windows, no way to escape. Air came through small, carefully concealed ventilation shafts. Over the years, Fritzl would make modifications, adding rooms as Elizabeth's children were born, all while keeping the entire operation a secret. Fritzl's meticulous planning extended to ensuring that no one in his life, neither his wife nor the authorities, would ever discover what lay beneath. He took extreme measures to control every aspect of the basement's existence, from its construction to its concealment. The perfect cover for the perfect crime, or so he believed. But while the dungeon remained undetected for 24 years, it was a ticking time bomb, a horrifying symbol of the evil that had been festering right beneath the surface of a quiet, unassuming family home. When Josef Fritzl lured his daughter into the dungeon for the first time, Elizabeth had no idea that her life was about to be ripped apart. What began as a moment of confusion soon turned into unimaginable horror. The reality of her new life, a life lived in the dark, beneath the very house she once called home, set in quickly. The shock of her situation was overwhelming. Elizabeth was trapped, completely at the mercy of her father, in a world no one else knew existed. In those early days, Elizabeth fought back, struggling to understand how the man she had known her entire life could do this to her. She screamed for help, hoping someone above ground would hear her cries through the thick walls, but no sound ever escaped. The dungeon's design was too perfect. Joseph, always in control, was prepared for her resistance. His response was swift and brutal. The abuse started immediately. Physical violence became a regular tool for Joseph to assert his dominance over her. He would beat her into submission whenever she resisted or begged for freedom. But it wasn't just the physical abuse that broke Elizabeth. It was the psychological warfare he waged on her mind. He made it clear that no one knew where she was, that no one was coming to save her, and that if she disobeyed, the consequences would be deadly. Elizabeth was plunged into isolation with no sense of time or the outside world. In the suffocating darkness of the dungeon, she had no choice but to endure the terror and confusion. Joseph would come and go as he pleased, entering her prison through a heavy, soundproofed door that only he could unlock. He was not just her captor, he was her tormentor. For Elizabeth, the early years of imprisonment were a battle between hope and despair. She held on to the belief that somehow someone would find her. She fought mentally and emotionally to survive the relentless assaults on her dignity and her body. But Joseph made it clear that her life now belonged to him. He controlled her food, her air, her light, and her very existence. As the days turned into years, Elizabeth's spirit was tested beyond imagination. The psychological abuse took on more complex forms. Joseph manipulated her emotions, alternating between violent outbursts and cold, methodical control. The mental toll was profound. Joseph knew that by breaking her spirit early on, he could maintain control over her for as long as he wanted. Those early years in the dungeon were a slow descent into a life defined by hopelessness. Elizabeth's attempts to resist were met with cruelty beyond comprehension, and each act of defiance was met with a new level of violence. What started as shock soon evolved into a terrifying routine, one in which her father's monstrous behavior became her new reality, her world reduced to the dark, cold walls of her underground prison. As the months of Elizabeth's captivity stretched on, Josef Fritzl escalated his abuse in the most horrific way imaginable. Locked in the windowless room beneath the house, with nothing but the hum of the ventilation system for air, Elizabeth's world shrank to the size of that tiny, suffocating space. And it was in that space that Joseph unleashed a new, unimaginable horror, repeated sexual assaults that would become a central part of her imprisonment. Joseph's control over Elizabeth had always been complete physically, emotionally, and psychologically, but now he used that control to violate her in the most intimate and violent way. He began raping her regularly, with no one to stop him, no one to even suspect what was happening. The dungeon was his twisted domain, and Elizabeth had nowhere to escape, no way to protect herself from the relentless assaults that would mark the beginning of her worst nightmare. The brutality of these attacks was compounded by the fact that Elizabeth was utterly alone. With no light, no hope, and no connection to the outside world, she endured the abuse in isolation. Each time he descended into the basement, Joseph would lock the door behind him, sealing them both into the dark, cold prison where Elizabeth's body became a battleground for his perverse desires. In the midst of this horrific routine, Elizabeth became pregnant, a result of the assaults she endured from her own father. In the cold and confined dungeon, Elizabeth found herself carrying the first of many children. The air was stale, and the small, cramped space offered no comfort, yet her body continued to transform under the weight of her pregnancy. For Elizabeth, this was a new form of captivity, one that went beyond the chains of her father's control. She was now imprisoned by the life growing inside her, a life she did not ask for, but one she would come to protect and love despite the circumstances. Joseph, on the other hand, saw the pregnancy as just another layer of his dominance over her, another means of control. The abuse did not stop with the pregnancy. Joseph continued his assaults even as Elizabeth's body changed with each passing day. He made sure that she remained isolated, her pregnancy a secret from the world above. As her stomach grew, so did the weight of her hopelessness, trapped in a world with no windows, limited air, and no future. Elizabeth's first pregnancy in this living hell marked the beginning of a new chapter in her life in captivity, one where she would not only endure the horrors of her father's violence, but also the heartbreak of raising children in the dungeon, cut off from the rest of the world. Between 1988 and 2002, Elisabeth Fritzl endured the unimaginable 7 pregnancies and the births of 7 children, all within the suffocating darkness of the dungeon her father had constructed. Without medical assistance in the cold, isolated confines of her underground prison, Elizabeth gave birth to each child in horrifying conditions, surrounded by the same 4 walls that had already trapped her for years. Each pregnancy was an overwhelming challenge for Elizabeth. She had no one to turn to, no doctor to guide her, no pain relief, and no proper hygiene. She was forced to rely entirely on her own instincts and sheer will to survive. Josef Fritzl provided the barest essentials, blankets, towels, a few supplies, but he gave her no real support. The air in the basement was stale, and there was barely enough space to move, let alone care for a newborn. When the time came to give birth, Elizabeth was alone, enduring hours of labor in the cramped, damp conditions of the dungeon. The pain was unbearable, and there was no one to ease her suffering. Each birth was an act of survival, a testament to her resilience in the face of Joseph's absolute control. She delivered her children on the cold, hard floor, with nothing but her hands to help bring them into the world. But the horror didn't end with the birth. Raising children in this underground hell was perhaps an even greater challenge. The dungeon, designed to keep them hidden from the world, was no place for young, innocent lives. There was no natural light, no fresh air, and no room for the children to grow or play. They were trapped just as she was, and Elizabeth had to find a way to care for them, nurture them, and keep them safe, all while remaining imprisoned herself. Josef Fritzl, the father of these children, continued his reign of terror. He controlled everything, dictating when they would receive food and supplies, and often neglecting their most basic needs. Yet, despite his cruelty, Elizabeth somehow managed to give her children love and care. She created a sense of normalcy within the chaos, teaching them, playing with them, and comforting them as best she could. She shielded them from the full knowledge of the horrors they were born into, but the dungeon's walls served as a constant reminder of their captivity. Three of the children were kept with Elizabeth in the dungeon, living under the same oppressive conditions that had broken her. They grew up knowing only darkness, with no concept of the outside world. Their entire reality was confined to the cold, cramped rooms where they were born. They had no contact with other children, no toys, no schools, nothing that resembled a normal childhood. But the other three children, in a twisted manipulation, were brought upstairs by Joseph and introduced to the world as abandoned babies, supposedly left on the Fritzl family's doorstep by Elizabeth. Joseph convinced his wife, Rosemary, that Elizabeth had run away to join a cult and was leaving her children behind. These children were raised above ground, just meters away from their mother and siblings, living a double life without ever knowing the truth. For Elizabeth, the heartbreak was unimaginable. She had to watch as her children were separated, some to live in the light, others to remain in the dungeon. She was forced to raise her children in secret, under the constant threat of punishment from Joseph if anything went wrong. Yet, through it all, Elizabeth held on to a glimmer of hope, protecting her children as best she could while enduring the never ending nightmare of captivity. The births of her seven children and the impossibility of raising them in secrecy underground became one of the most shocking aspects of the Fritzl case, a tale of survival in the most harrowing circumstances imaginable. The dark, damp dungeon where Elisabeth Fritzl and three of her children lived was not just a physical prison. It was a place of unimaginable psychological torment. The dungeon had no windows, no sense of time, and no escape. Life underground became a never ending cycle of fear, deprivation, and survival. The space was cramped, with just a few small rooms barely large enough to accommodate the essentials for living. A narrow bathroom with minimal plumbing, a makeshift kitchen area, and a small sleeping space were all they had. Josef Fritzl had designed this dungeon to be self-contained, but also suffocatingly tight, giving Elizabeth and her children the bare minimum to survive. The rooms were soundproofed, ensuring that no matter how much they screamed or cried for help, their voices would never reach the world above. For 24 years, Elizabeth lived in this underground prison, first alone and then with her children. Life for them was monotonous, marked by strict rules enforced by Joseph, who controlled every aspect of their existence. He would come down to the dungeon at unpredictable times, bringing food and supplies, but also terror and abuse. Joseph decided when they could eat, when they had light, and even when they could breathe fresh air. The limited ventilation system was under his control, and he would sometimes cut off air to remind them that he held their lives in his hands. The psychological toll on Elizabeth and her children was immense. Living in constant fear of Joseph, they never knew what each day would bring. For the children who had been born in the dungeon, this underground existence was all they had ever known. They had no concept of daylight, no idea of what a normal life looked like. Their entire world was defined by the cold walls around them and the brief, terrifying visits from Joseph. Elizabeth did everything she could to shield her children from the full reality of their situation. She created routines, told them stories, and tried to educate them as best as she could. But no matter how hard she tried, the weight of their imprisonment was inescapable. They lived in a state of constant dread, knowing that Joseph could appear at any moment to impose his will. Joseph maintained absolute control over the family through fear and manipulation. He would bring Elizabeth letters from the outside world, fake letters he forced her to write, pretending that she was off living a new life. He used these letters as a psychological weapon, reminding her that no one was looking for her, that she had been forgotten. He manipulated the children too, telling them stories about the world outside to confuse and control them, while threatening them with starvation or even death if they disobeyed him. For Elizabeth, the most heartbreaking part was watching her children grow up in this nightmare. She was their protector, their teacher, and their only source of comfort, but there was only so much she could do. The children developed in a distorted reality, never seeing sunlight, never meeting another person. They grew up surrounded by darkness with no sense of freedom or hope. The psychological impact on all of them was devastating. Elizabeth, already traumatized by her years of abuse at the hands of her father, now had to bear the guilt and pain of raising her children in captivity. She suffered from chronic stress, anxiety, and depression, yet somehow managed to keep going for the sake of her children. The children themselves showed signs of severe psychological distress, anxiety, fear of strangers, developmental delays, and difficulty understanding the world beyond the dungeon. In many ways, the dungeon was not just a prison for their bodies, it was a prison for their minds. The psychological toll of living in such extreme isolation under the constant threat of violence took something from them that would never fully heal. Joseph had built a prison to control them physically, but his real power was in how he controlled their minds, keeping them locked in fear and confusion for 24 years. Despite the unimaginable horrors they faced, Elizabeth never gave up hope. She fought to keep her children alive and mentally strong, even in the darkest of times. She was their only source of love, warmth, and protection in a world that had been reduced to cold, concrete walls. But the psychological scars of their life underground would last far beyond their eventual escape. On the surface, Josef Fritzl was the embodiment of a hard-working, successful man. He lived in the modest, picturesque town of Amstetten, Austria, where he was known as a skilled engineer and a respectable family man. To the outside world, he was a devoted husband to Rosemary and a father who had raised 7 children, all while balancing his professional life. He appeared to be the kind of man who worked diligently to provide for his family, a pillar of the community. Fritzl's public image was meticulously crafted. He was often described by neighbors and acquaintances as strict but reliable, a man of routine. He spent time maintaining his property, and no one questioned his frequent trips to the basement. To most, it seemed like he was simply engaged in household projects or working on his business. In fact, some neighbors even admired his apparent work ethic. He was seen as a man who kept to himself but did so without raising suspicion. Behind this carefully curated facade, however, Fritzl was leading a dual life. While the community saw him as an ordinary family man, what they couldn't see was the monstrous reality that existed just beneath their feet. For 24 years, he had concealed his daughter, Elizabeth, and 3 of her children in a secret dungeon, carrying out horrific crimes just a few meters away from his unsuspecting family and neighbors. Fritzl's ability to maintain this image came down to his manipulative nature and meticulous planning. He controlled every aspect of the narrative. He convinced his wife, Rosemary, and others that Elizabeth had run away to join a cult, fabricating letters that supported his lie. The letters were a key part of his deception, as they painted the picture of a daughter who had voluntarily cut ties with her family, making it seem as though any attempt to find her would be futile. In his community, Josef Fritzl was also a landlord who owned several properties. He used this status to bolster his image as a responsible and upstanding figure. He rented out apartments and interacted with tenants, none of whom suspected that the man they were dealing with was hiding such dark secrets. Even the police, when investigating Elizabeth's initial disappearance, had no reason to suspect Fritzl of any wrongdoing. His ability to blend into normal society was so effective that even his closest associates and neighbors were completely unaware of the horrors he was committing. Fritzl was adept at keeping his two lives separate. His public persona was one of control, precision, and authority. He was the type of man who commanded respect in his dealings with others. Yet, this very control allowed him to manipulate those around him, keeping them from ever suspecting the truth. He knew how to speak confidently, how to deflect questions, and how to maintain an air of normalcy, even when visiting his secret dungeon to commit unspeakable crimes. His wife, Rosemary, lived in the same house for years, entirely oblivious to the fact that her own daughter and grandchildren were imprisoned just beneath her feet. Fritzl's ability to compartmentalize his life allowed him to carry on his daily activities as if nothing was wrong. He could sit at the dinner table with his wife, entertain guests, and continue his work, all while maintaining total control over the horrific world he had created in the basement. The community, in turn, never saw any reason to look beyond what they knew. Fritzl wasn't the type of man who drew attention to himself. He wasn't overly social, but he wasn't reclusive. Either he was just another neighbor living an ordinary life in an ordinary town. But beneath that veneer of normalcy lay one of the most shocking and deeply disturbing criminal secrets the world would ever uncover. By the time Fritzl's crimes were finally exposed in 2008, the sheer contrast between his public image and the reality of his actions stunned not only the people of Amstetten, but the entire world. How could a man who appeared so normal, so unremarkable, have committed such monstrous acts right under everyone's noses? It was a chilling reminder of the darkness that can hide behind the most ordinary facades. Amid the horrors unfolding in the dungeon beneath the Fritzl household, Josef Fritzl devised a plan that would allow him to maintain his dark secret while presenting a shocking twist in the narrative of his public life. Out of the 7 children Elizabeth gave birth to during her years of captivity, 3 were taken from the dungeon and raised upstairs right under the same roof as their imprisoned mother and siblings, yet in the light of day where they would be seen by the world. Joseph's manipulation began with fake letters that he forced Elizabeth to write. In these letters, he painted a story that Elizabeth had abandoned her children, further reinforcing the lie he had told his family and the authorities about her supposed decision to join a cult. In this fabricated narrative, Elizabeth would leave her babies on the Fritzl family's doorstep, pleading for her parents to take care of them because she was unable to provide for them. Each time a child was discovered, Joseph would conveniently produce another letter, always justifying why the child had been left behind and why Elizabeth could not return. The first child to be brought upstairs was Lisa, born in 1993. Joseph left her in a cardboard box on the Fritzl's doorstep, complete with one of Elizabeth's letters claiming the baby had been abandoned. Joseph presented the baby to his wife, Rosemary, as their grandchild, abandoned by their runaway daughter. Rosemary, unaware of the true horrors happening below, accepted this version of events without question. She was overjoyed to care for Lisa and believed, like everyone else, that her daughter was somewhere far away, unable to raise her own child. Over the next several years, 2 more children were taken from the dungeon and brought upstairs in a similar manner. Monica, born in 1994, and Alexander, born in 1996. With each arrival, Joseph repeated the same story. He would find the children, accompanied by Elizabeth's forged letters, and bring them into the household, convincing everyone that these were her children, abandoned for their grandparents to raise. To outsiders, and even to Rosemary, the situation seemed tragic but believable. Joseph had created such a thorough narrative complete with the emotional letters from a daughter they believed had run away that no one thought to question the strange circumstances. In fact, the authorities were also taken in by the story. Social services regularly visited the Fritzl home to check on the children, and each time they found no reason to suspect that anything was amiss. They believed the official story. Elisabeth had run away, and her parents were now the caretakers of her children. The children who lived upstairs grew up in what appeared to be a normal home. They attended school, had friends, and lived a life that seemed entirely ordinary to the outside world. They were, in many ways, innocent pawns in Joseph's web of deception. They had no idea that their mother and siblings were trapped just a few meters below them, living in total darkness while they experienced life in the sunlight. Joseph's manipulation extended to everyone who came into contact with the family. He played the role of the concerned grandfather, a man who had stepped up to care for his abandoned grandchildren. The fake letters were so convincing that even the authorities believed them. The tone and content of these letters reflected a desperate young woman stuck in a cult, pleading with her family to care for her children. Joseph knew exactly how to construct the narrative, drawing on emotions and family bonds to make his story believable. But while the children upstairs lived seemingly normal lives, their siblings below were suffering in unimaginable conditions. Elizabeth, still imprisoned with the other three children, could only dream of the day when they too might be freed from their underground hell. Every time Joseph took one of her children upstairs, it was a mixture of heartbreak and relief. She had to watch them leave, knowing they would never come back, but at least they would escape the dungeon's crushing darkness. Joseph's ability to keep this secret for so long was a testament to his complete control over the situation. He had successfully built and maintained two separate worlds, one above, where life appeared normal, and one below, where his darkest secrets were kept. The letters he forced Elizabeth to write became the key to sustaining his lie, allowing him to manipulate not only his wife, but also the authorities, ensuring that no one ever looked too closely at what was really happening inside the Fritzl home. For years, the children upstairs lived in blissful ignorance of the horrors their mother and siblings were enduring below. They had no reason to suspect that their family was anything but normal, nor did they understand the tragic circumstances of their own births. But the truth, hidden for so long, would eventually come crashing down, exposing the terrible secrets Joseph had so carefully constructed. The turning point in 2008 came when Kirsten, Elizabeth's eldest child, who had spent her entire life in the dungeon, fell gravely ill. After years of enduring the darkness and suffocating conditions of the underground prison, Kirsten's health began to deteriorate rapidly. She had never experienced the outside world, no fresh air, no natural sunlight, and no real medical care since the day she was born. The combination of these factors eventually took its toll on her fragile body. At 19 years old, Kirsten was suffering from severe health complications that Elizabeth couldn't manage with the limited resources available in the dungeon. Her condition worsened as she struggled to breathe and lost consciousness. Elizabeth, terrified for her daughter's life, knew that this was beyond her ability to help. Despite the fear of what might happen to her and the other children, she begged Joseph to take Kirsten to a hospital. For 24 years, Joseph had controlled every aspect of their existence, and until this moment, he had refused any connection between the underground world he had created and the outside world. But now, for the first time, Joseph's control was being challenged by something he couldn't manage: the worsening condition of his own grandchild, who was also his daughter. Reluctantly, and fearing that Kirsten's death would raise questions he couldn't answer, Joseph made the decision that would ultimately unravel everything. He allowed Kirsten to be taken to the hospital. On April 26, 2008, Joseph brought Kirsten out of the dungeon and drove her to the Amsterdam hospital, claiming she had been abandoned on his doorstep by Elizabeth, who was still supposedly living in a cult. He used the same fabricated story that had worked so well in the past, but this time things didn't go according to plan. The doctors at the hospital were immediately alarmed by Kirsten's condition. She was in critical health, malnourished, pale, and clearly suffering from multiple untreated conditions. But it wasn't just her physical state that raised concerns. The doctors were puzzled by her complete lack of medical history and her unfamiliarity with basic things like sunlight and fresh air. Kirsten's condition, combined with the strange circumstances of her arrival, triggered a sense of suspicion among the medical staff. Despite Joseph's story that she had been abandoned, the doctors pressed for more information. They wanted to speak to Elisabeth directly, and without her presence, the situation seemed increasingly suspicious. Hospital staff alerted the authorities, who began an investigation into Kirsten's origins and the bizarre circumstances surrounding her sudden appearance at the hospital. As the investigation deepened, Joseph struggled to maintain his lies. The police were determined to track down Elisabeth, hoping she could provide answers about her daughter's mysterious condition. The community, once oblivious to the horrors within Joseph's household, began to take notice. The authorities ramped up their efforts, not satisfied with the story Joseph had presented for so many years. They wanted to find Elisabeth. This marked the beginning of the end for Josef Fritzl's double life. As Kirsten lay in the hospital fighting for her life, Joseph's carefully constructed web of lies began to unravel. The pressure mounted on him to produce Elisabeth, and he could no longer rely on his fake letters and fabricated stories to keep the truth hidden. He had held control for decades, but the weight of Kirsten's illness and the questions it raised finally cracked the facade. Fritzl had no choice but to bring Elisabeth out of the dungeon after 24 years of captivity. He concocted a final plan, hoping to cover up his crimes by claiming that Elisabeth had come back from the cult to see her sick daughter. But this time, the authorities weren't willing to accept his story at face value. When Elisabeth finally appeared at the hospital to be with Kirsten, the police took her into custody for questioning. It was in this moment, in the sterile confines of the hospital, that Elisabeth made the decision that would bring down Joseph's reign of terror. After 2 decades of silence, Elisabeth broke down and told the police everything. She revealed the horrifying truth about her captivity, the dungeon, the years of abuse, and the 7 children born in that underground hell. The story was beyond comprehension, but the police immediately realized that Elisabeth was telling the truth. In that moment, Josef Fritzl's dark, hidden world was exposed to the light, and his years of control, manipulation, and abuse finally came crashing down. Kirsten's illness, a tragedy born out of the years of captivity, became the key to Elisabeth and her children's freedom. What Joseph had spent so many years concealing was laid bare because of the one thing he couldn't control, the health of his daughter. His decision to take Kirsten to the hospital was driven by his desire to maintain control, but it was the very act that would strip him of that power and lead to his ultimate downfall. When Josef Fritzl arrived at the Amstetten hospital with Kirsten, the condition of the young woman immediately raised alarms among the hospital staff. It wasn't just the fact that she was in critical condition, it was the entire context surrounding her that felt off. From the moment Kirsten was admitted, medical professionals couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Kirsten was emaciated, pale, and showed signs of having lived in deeply unhealthy conditions for an extended period. Her skin was nearly translucent, as if she had not been exposed to natural light for years, and she exhibited symptoms of severe malnutrition and untreated ailments. In addition to her immediate physical state, it was clear that her body had been deprived of basic health care for her entire life. She had no medical history, no records of vaccinations, and seemed utterly unfamiliar with the outside world. These were red flags that something was deeply amiss. While Fritzl tried to present his well-practiced story about Elisabeth abandoning her children to live with a cult, the hospital staff couldn't reconcile Kirsten's condition with his version of events. The young woman's state seemed too extreme to have resulted from just a few weeks of neglect. Her symptoms symptoms, particularly the signs of long-term malnutrition and the unfamiliarity with basic stimuli like fresh air, pointed to something far more disturbing. The doctors and nurses became especially suspicious of the way Joseph spoke about the situation. His answers were vague, and while he tried to seem concerned, his behavior was inconsistent. He presented himself as the caring grandfather trying to help his abandoned granddaughter, but the more the medical staff questioned him, the less convincing his story became. Joseph's controlled demeanor couldn't mask the oddity of the situation. The pieces didn't fit, and the doctors knew it. It wasn't just the physical symptoms that raised suspicions, it was also Kirsten's behavior. She was withdrawn, frightened, and seemed entirely disoriented. She didn't respond to basic social interactions in a way that a typical teenager would. She lacked any understanding of the world beyond what could be found in a small, confined space. It was as though she had never experienced life outside of a dark room. These observations sent alarm bells ringing through the hospital. Recognizing the severity of the situation, the hospital staff decided to dig deeper. They needed more information and answers about Kirsten's origins and medical history. When they pressed Joseph for details, he became evasive, sticking to his story about Elizabeth's disappearance and her supposed involvement in a cult. But the more he deflected, the more suspicious he appeared. The hospital's medical professionals, trained to recognize signs of abuse and neglect, were not convinced. They sensed that there was a darker, hidden truth behind Kirsten's condition, something far more sinister than Joseph was letting on. Realizing that they were dealing with a potential case of long-term abuse, the hospital staff made the critical decision to alert the authorities. This was a crucial moment in unraveling the case. The doctors and nurses understood that the story Joseph was spinning didn't align with Kirsten's dire condition, and their persistence in pursuing answers was key to breaking the case wide open. They contacted the police, expressing their concerns about the strange circumstances and asking for an investigation. The role of the medical professionals in this turning point cannot be overstated. They were the first people outside of Joseph's immediate control to come into contact with Kirsten, and their medical expertise allowed them to see through the facade he had maintained for so long. Without their keen observations and swift actions, it's possible that Joseph could have found a way to continue his deception. In addition to alerting the police, the hospital staff also reached out to the media, hoping that public attention might force answers out of the Fritzl family. The press coverage added pressure to the authorities to take action and find Elizabeth, who had seemingly disappeared without a trace all those years ago. Joseph had relied on his story of her running away to a cult for so long, but under the scrutiny of medical professionals and the media, his lies began to unravel. The hospital's intervention set the wheels in motion for the eventual liberation of Elizabeth and her children. What began as routine medical care for a gravely ill patient quickly turned into the catalyst for one of the most horrifying criminal cases in modern history. Thanks to the vigilance and intuition of the hospital staff, the truth behind Kirsten's illness became the key to unlocking the terrifying secrets that had been buried beneath the Fritzl home for over 2 decades. After the hospital staff raised alarms about Kirsten's mysterious condition, the police were quickly brought into the fold. What began as a routine medical investigation had rapidly evolved into something far more sinister, and the authorities were tasked with finding out the truth behind Kirsten's alarming state and the increasingly suspicious story Josef Fritzl was telling. The first step for the police was to interview Joseph. When they questioned him about Kirsten's origins, Joseph stuck to the same story he had been telling for years. Elizabeth, his missing daughter, had run away at the age of 18 to join a cult, leaving behind her children one by one on the doorstep of the Fritzl home. This was the explanation Joseph had given every time a new child appeared, and it had, up until now, been accepted by both his family and the local authorities. However, given the severity of Kirsten's condition and the strange circumstances surrounding her sudden appearance, the police were not convinced by Joseph's explanation. They pressed him further, asking for details about Elizabeth's whereabouts and her involvement with this so called cult. Joseph provided vague, inconsistent responses, and as the officers probed deeper, it became clear that his story wasn't holding up under scrutiny. Joseph's demeanor during questioning was also troubling. While he attempted to project calm and control, the cracks in his carefully constructed facade began to show. He seemed evasive, avoiding direct answers and deflecting questions about his daughter. When the police asked why Elizabeth had abandoned her children without seeking medical care for Kirsten, Joseph could only offer the same tired excuse that Elizabeth was deeply involved in the cult and could not risk exposing herself. But the police weren't satisfied with his answers. Kirsten's critical condition and the complete lack of medical records for the other children were red flags that indicated something far more troubling was at play. Additionally, the hospital staff had described Kirsten's behavior, which pointed to long-term isolation and abuse far beyond what could be explained by the story of a cult. Realizing that Joseph's story was quickly falling apart, the police took the next logical step. They needed to find Elizabeth. If Joseph's version of events was true, she would be able to explain everything, and the mystery would be solved. However, locating Elizabeth was no easy task. For 24 years, Joseph had kept up the lie that his daughter was somewhere far away, living in a secretive and unreachable community. Now, under growing pressure, Joseph was forced to come up with a plan. As the police increased their questioning, the walls of Joseph's deception began to close in. He knew that his carefully crafted lies were no longer enough to keep the authorities at bay. He promised to bring Elizabeth back, claiming that he could get in contact with her and persuade her to return home to explain the situation. This was the first indication to the police that Joseph might know more about his daughter's whereabouts than he had let on. The officers, though suspicious, agreed to give Joseph a chance to produce Elizabeth, hoping that she might provide some clarity about Kirsten's condition and the strange series of events surrounding her reappearance. This decision would ultimately lead to the breaking point in the investigation. Behind the scenes, the police were already digging deeper into Joseph's life. They were reviewing the past reports of Elizabeth's disappearance, looking into the timeline of events, and searching for any inconsistencies that could point to something more sinister. As more officers were assigned to the case, it became clear that this wasn't just a missing persons investigation. There was something deeply wrong about Josef Fritzl's version of reality. By now, the police had alerted higher authorities and the media as Kirsten's mysterious illness and Elizabeth's long disappearance were gaining attention. The pressure was mounting for Joseph to produce answers, and the authorities were beginning to suspect that the truth might be far darker than they had initially imagined. While the investigation was still in its early stages, the police were starting to piece together a timeline that didn't add up. How could Elizabeth have vanished so completely for 2 decades without any real trace of her existence? Why did she leave behind multiple children, all with the same troubling health issues? And most pressing of all, where was Elizabeth now, and why hadn't she come forward earlier to help her daughter, Kirsten? Josef Fritzl, once confident in his ability to control the narrative, was beginning to lose his grip. The police weren't just looking for Elizabeth anymore, they were starting to see Joseph as the key to a much darker mystery. The investigation was now focused on unraveling the truth behind Elizabeth's disappearance and understanding how this family had been living under a cloud of secrecy for so long. As the police prepared to confront Joseph with their growing suspicions, the walls of his lies were closing in. His carefully maintained image of a normal family man was about to shatter, and the horrifying truth that had been hidden for 24 years was about to come to light. The police were on the verge of discovering what Joseph had fought so hard to keep hidden, and the investigation was about to take a chilling turn that no one could have anticipated. After 24 years of being held captive in the suffocating darkness of the basement, Elisabeth Fritzl experienced a moment she had long given up on, a chance at freedom. The catalyst for her liberation was her daughter Kirsten's critical condition. The situation had spiraled out of Joseph's control, and for the first time in over 2 decades, he had to face a reality he could not manipulate or suppress. With the pressure mounting from both the hospital staff and the police, Joseph knew that his lies were unraveling. Kirsten's illness had attracted too much attention, and the authorities were demanding answers he could no longer fabricate. The fake letters and stories about Elizabeth's supposed involvement in a cult were no longer holding up under scrutiny. Joseph realized that if he didn't produce Elizabeth soon, the investigation would expose the dark secret he had kept hidden beneath his house for so long. In a desperate attempt to regain control, Joseph made a monumental decision. He would allow Elizabeth to leave the dungeon for the first time since he had imprisoned her in 1984. His plan was to bring her to the hospital where she could help care for Kirsten, and he hoped that this would somehow satisfy the authorities' demands. It was a gamble one he hoped would prevent his crimes from being exposed. For Elizabeth, this was an overwhelming moment. After 24 years in captivity, after giving birth to 7 children in the dark, windowless dungeon, she was finally going to leave the underground prison that had been her world for so long. It was the first time in over 2 decades that she would see daylight, breathe fresh air, and step into a world that had moved on without her. When Joseph unlocked the door to the dungeon and led Elizabeth up the stairs, it was both terrifying and liberating. Elizabeth had spent years raising her children in those cramped quarters, enduring unimaginable abuse, and now, for the first time, she was about to step outside the confines of her father's control. She had dreamed of escape for so long, but the reality of leaving the dungeon was filled with uncertainty. What would happen to her? Would she be believed? Would she be punished if Joseph's plan failed? Joseph drove Elizabeth to the hospital under the pretense that she had returned from the cult to help her sick daughter. As they approached the hospital, Elizabeth, overwhelmed by the sights and sounds of the outside world, felt a mix of fear and relief. It had been so long since she had been in daylight that her eyes struggled to adjust to the brightness. The simple act of stepping outside, feeling the warmth of the sun, and seeing other people was both surreal and disorienting. At the hospital, the authorities were waiting. The moment Elizabeth arrived, the police moved swiftly, taking her into custody for questioning. Joseph had thought he could still control the situation, but what he didn't anticipate was the power of Elizabeth's truth. For the first time, she was away from the dungeon and away from Joseph's immediate control. In that hospital, with Kirsten lying in critical condition, Elizabeth made the decision that would change everything. She would tell the truth. For the authorities, this was a pivotal moment. They had been suspicious of Joseph's story, but nothing could have prepared them for the reality that was about to unfold. When Elizabeth sat down with the police, she hesitated at first, fearful of what might happen to her and her children if Joseph retaliated. But then, after 24 years of silence, she began to speak, and once she started, she couldn't stop. In a harrowing and emotional account, Elizabeth told the police everything: the abduction, the rapes, the dungeon, and the children born in captivity. She described the unimaginable conditions in which she and her children had been forced to live, hidden from the world beneath her own family home. She told them about Joseph's manipulative control, the psychological and physical abuse, and the years of suffering she had endured. The authorities were stunned by the enormity of the story. It was more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. Elizabeth's liberation was not just the moment she stepped out of the dungeon. It was the moment she found her voice, the moment she reclaimed her life and the lives of her children. The truth was finally out, and with it came the inevitable downfall of Josef Fritzl. Within hours of Elizabeth's confession, the police moved in to secure the Fritzl home. They discovered the dungeon, the secret prison that had been hidden for decades. What they found was shocking: a complex of small, suffocating rooms, a place where light and hope had been absent for so long. The conditions were as horrific as Elizabeth had described, a chilling testament to the unimaginable cruelty that had been inflicted upon her and her children. Elizabeth's liberation marked the end of 24 years of torment, but it was only the beginning of a long journey toward healing and justice. She and her children were finally free from the dungeon, but the trauma of their captivity would take years to unravel. For Elizabeth, stepping into the light for the first time was the first step toward reclaiming a life that had been stolen from her, a life that Joseph had controlled for far too long. It was a moment of both liberation and justice, a moment that would finally bring the truth to light and expose one of the most horrifying crimes in modern history. When Elisabeth Fritzl sat down with the police for the first time in over 24 years, it was a moment of unimaginable gravity. The weight of decades of unspeakable abuse pressed on her shoulders, but she had finally found herself in a situation where she could break the silence that had imprisoned her as much as the dungeon itself. As the authorities leaned in, eager for answers about Kirsten's illness and the strange circumstances surrounding her family, they could never have predicted the devastating revelations that were about to unfold. At first, Elizabeth was hesitant. After all, Josef Fritzl had conditioned her for years to fear retribution, to believe that no one would help her, that even if she tried to escape, her life and the lives of her children would be destroyed. But as the police pressed gently for details, Elizabeth began to sense something different. She wasn't in the dungeon anymore. Joseph wasn't there to silence her. For the first time in decades, she had the chance to tell her story, and in that moment, she made a choice that would change everything. Her voice, at first shaky and uncertain, soon grew steady as she began to reveal the dark truth that had been hidden beneath the Fritzl household for so many years. She told the police how, at just 18 years old, her father had lured her into the basement under the pretense of helping him with a chore, only to imprison her in the dungeon he had built for that very purpose. She described how she had fought and pleaded with him in the beginning, hoping for mercy, but Joseph's response was brutal. He beat her into submission and made it clear that no one would ever come for her, that she was his prisoner, entirely at his mercy. As Elizabeth spoke, the room fell into stunned silence. The police, who had dealt with countless cases in their careers, were unprepared for the sheer magnitude of the horror she was describing. What they had initially thought might be a case of family neglect or child abuse was quickly turning into something far darker, a story of systematic imprisonment, rape, and psychological torture that had spanned nearly a quarter of a century. Elizabeth's story continued. She detailed the rapes, how Joseph would come down to the dungeon whenever he pleased, locking the door behind him, and subject her to sexual violence. She revealed the terror she lived in every day, knowing that her father controlled everything in her life, including whether she would eat, breathe fresh air, or see her children raised outside the dungeon's walls. Perhaps most horrifying to the police was the revelation of the 7 children born in captivity, 3 of whom had been kept with Elizabeth underground, while the other 3 had been taken upstairs to live with Joseph and Rosemary. The sheer logistics of it all, the births without medical assistance, the isolation, the mental and emotional toll on Elizabeth and the children was almost too much to comprehend. Each new detail added a layer of shock, and it was becoming clear that this was one of the most heinous crimes in modern history. As Elizabeth described the conditions of the dungeon, the police were horrified. There had been no windows, no sunlight, and no escape for her or her children. The air they breathed was recycled through small ventilation shafts, and they lived in total isolation, unaware of the world outside. The children who had remained with her had never seen daylight or known what it was to walk freely outside. They had grown up in a world defined by 4 concrete walls, with their mother as their only source of comfort and education. With each word Elizabeth spoke, the sheer horror of the situation became more and more apparent to the police. The calculated cruelty of Josef Fritzl, his ability to maintain such an elaborate and secretive form of abuse for decades without being caught, was beyond anything they had ever encountered. The shock wasn't just in the details of the abuse, but in the realization that this had all happened beneath the very surface of everyday life in Amsterdam without anyone noticing. The Fritzl family had lived in the same house, interacted with neighbors, and existed in the community while a hidden nightmare unfolded just below. The officers listening to Elizabeth knew they were hearing something that would change everything. They began to mobilize, realizing that this was no longer a missing persons case or a simple child neglect situation. This was an international crime of unspeakable proportions. The sheer scope of the abuse was difficult to process, but they knew they had to act quickly. The dungeon had to be found, and Joseph had to be confronted with the overwhelming evidence of his crimes. As Elizabeth finished telling her story, the police were left in stunned silence. The full truth had finally come to light. What had been hidden for so long beneath the Fritzl home was now exposed to the world, and there was no turning back. The authorities immediately secured warrants to search the house, and within hours they uncovered the dungeon just as Elizabeth had described it. The rooms were small, dark, and suffocating, with barely enough space for the three children still living there. It was a horrifying sight, and one that would haunt the officers involved for years to come. The exposure of Josef Fritzl's secret was a moment of both justice and horror. Justice because after 24 years, Elizabeth and her children were finally free from their underground prison. Horror because the full extent of Joseph's monstrous crimes had been revealed to a world that could barely comprehend the cruelty he had inflicted on his own family. As the investigation deepened and the public became aware of the details, the Josef Fritzl case would go down as one of the most shocking and disturbing in modern history, a chilling reminder of the evil that can hide behind even the most ordinary of facades. The arrest of Josef Fritzl was the climactic moment when the full extent of his horrific crimes came crashing down on him. For more than 24 years, he had lived a life of deception, keeping his daughter and their children hidden in a dungeon beneath his family home, while presenting himself as a normal, if somewhat strict, family man. But the moment Elizabeth revealed the truth to the authorities, the facade Fritzl had carefully maintained unraveled completely. When the police arrived at the Fritzl home with a warrant, they were no longer investigating a case of a missing person or child neglect. They were entering the scene of one of the most disturbing crimes in modern history. They approached the house with the knowledge that a secret dungeon was hidden below, containing the dark reality of Elizabeth's captivity. Joseph, who had grown accustomed to his control over the situation, could no longer manipulate the narrative. The moment of Fritzl's arrest was swift and decisive. Police surrounded the house, securing the perimeter and ensuring there was no way for him to escape. Joseph, aware that the truth had been exposed, didn't resist. His demeanor, shockingly calm and composed, was unsettling to the officers. He didn't beg, didn't panic, he knew the game was over, and it was almost as if he had resigned himself to the consequences. The control he had clung to for so long had slipped away, but Fritzl, a man used to holding power over others, walked quietly with the officers as they led him away. His arrest sent shockwaves through the town of Amsterdam and soon the entire world. As news spread of the atrocities that had taken place under the noses of Fritzl's family, neighbors, and the community, disbelief turned into outrage. How could something so monstrous have happened in such a quiet, ordinary place? The Fritzl family home, once just another house in the neighborhood, was now revealed to be the site of decades of unspeakable abuse. In Amsterdam, residents struggled to comprehend the scope of the crime. Joseph had lived among them for years, and while many described him as a strict, somewhat controlling figure, no one had ever suspected that such a terrible secret was being harbored within the walls of his home. He was known for keeping to himself, often working on projects in his basement, which now seemed like an ominous detail in retrospect. Neighbors recalled seeing him as a diligent man, perhaps stern, but nothing more. The fact that he had imprisoned his daughter and fathered several children with her in that very basement was beyond comprehension. The news media descended on the small town, amplifying the sense of horror and disbelief. As the details of Joseph's crimes became public, the community grappled with feelings of guilt, confusion, and anger. How had no one noticed? How could someone who appeared so ordinary have concealed such a monstrous double life for so long? The very ordinariness of Fritzl's public persona was what made the crime so chilling. It wasn't just a case of a hidden horror. It was a story about the evil that can hide behind the most mundane of facades. The revelations about the dungeon, the systematic abuse, and the children born in captivity left the public reeling. The community of Amstetten, which had prided itself on being a quiet, close-knit town, now found itself at the center of international attention, the site of a crime that had shocked the world. Journalists and reporters crowded the streets, trying to make sense of the unthinkable events that had taken place. As Josef Fritzl sat in police custody, his demeanor remained eerily calm. He showed no visible signs of remorse, no outward expression of regret for the decades of abuse he had inflicted on his daughter and their children. When questioned, he admitted to many of his crimes, but he attempted to justify his actions, saying that he had provided for the children financially and that he had given them a life of sorts, even though it was a life in captivity. His cold, detached rationalization only added to the horror. For the people of Amstetten, Joseph's arrest and the exposure of his crimes felt like a betrayal. This was a man they had lived alongside, a man they had trusted in their community. And yet, all the while, he had been concealing a brutal, harrowing secret just beneath the surface. The Fritzl case cast a shadow over the town, a reminder of the evil that had existed in their midst without anyone realizing it. In the days that followed, authorities uncovered more details about the dungeon, its construction, the methods Joseph used to keep it hidden, and the extreme measures he had taken to ensure that no one would ever discover his dark secret. It was a nightmare that had lasted nearly a quarter of a century, and as the world learned more about the depths of Josef Fritzl's crimes, the shock and outrage only grew. Josef Fritzl's arrest was not just the end of his reign of terror over his family, it was the beginning of a long process of reckoning for the town, the authorities, and the world. As he was led away in handcuffs, the community was left to grapple with the horrifying reality that someone they had known for years had been capable of such unspeakable acts. The truth had finally come to light, but the scars of Josef Fritzl's actions would linger for years to come, not only for Elisabeth and her children, but for the entire town of Amstetten. As soon as Josef Fritzl was arrested, authorities launched a massive investigation to uncover the full extent of his crimes. What had initially seemed like an isolated case of child neglect quickly unraveled into one of the most disturbing criminal investigations in modern history. The sheer scope of what Fritzl had done left investigators scrambling to understand how such horrific acts had been concealed for so long, and how a family had lived in captivity just meters beneath the surface of a quiet Austrian home. The first step in the investigation was to gather as much evidence as possible from Elisabeth Fritzl and her children. Elisabeth had already provided a detailed account of her 24 years of imprisonment, but it was critical for the authorities to corroborate her testimony and gather physical evidence from the dungeon itself. Investigators began by piecing together the story through the letters Joseph had forced Elisabeth to write over the years. These letters, which had been used to justify the appearance of her children on the family's doorstep, had fooled authorities and social workers for years, but now they were recognized as a key part of Joseph's elaborate deception. The letters were written in Elizabeth's hand but dictated by Joseph, each one designed to reinforce the lie that she had willingly joined a cult and had chosen to abandon her children. The investigators examined these letters closely, comparing the language and handwriting over time to build a timeline of when each child had been born and how Joseph had used these letters to explain their sudden appearance. It was clear that Joseph had carefully crafted each one to prevent any suspicion from falling on him or his household. But the investigation went much deeper than the letters. Forensic teams were dispatched to the Fritzl home, and what they uncovered was far beyond what anyone had imagined. The entrance to the dungeon was concealed behind a series of locked doors, hidden so well that even Joseph's wife, Rosemary, had no idea what lay beneath their feet. Investigators had to pass through multiple layers of security, including a reinforced steel door that was soundproofed and impossible to open without Joseph's key. It became immediately clear how Joseph had managed to hide his crimes for so long. His engineering expertise had allowed him to construct a virtually impenetrable prison beneath his own home. Inside the dungeon, investigators found the small, cramped rooms where Elisabeth and her children had lived for years. There was no natural light, no windows, and very little space. The air was stale, and the rooms were filled with the barest of essentials: a makeshift bathroom, a small kitchen area, and sleeping spaces that were little more than mattresses on the cold concrete floor. The rooms had been outfitted with minimal ventilation, and it was clear that the conditions had been designed to ensure that no sound or light escaped. The dungeon itself was a chilling testament to the years of careful planning Joseph had invested in his crime. Investigators meticulously documented the layout of the dungeon, taking note of every detail. The space had been expanded over time to accommodate the growing number of children born in captivity, with Joseph adding additional rooms as needed. Each modification had been carefully planned to maintain the dungeon's secrecy, and investigators marveled at the lengths to which Joseph had gone to ensure that no one ever discovered what was happening beneath the Fritzl home. As they pieced together the physical evidence, authorities also interviewed Elisabeth and her children extensively. Each child provided details about their life underground, and the investigators used this information to reconstruct the timeline of events. The children born in captivity had grown up with no knowledge of the outside world, and their accounts of life in the dungeon were both heartbreaking and vital to the investigation. The children described how Joseph had visited the dungeon at random intervals, bringing food and supplies, but also imposing his will through violence and manipulation. Their accounts of the abuse matched Elizabeth's, painting a vivid picture of the years of torment they had endured. Medical examinations of Elizabeth and the children provided further evidence of the long-term abuse. The children, especially those who had lived their entire lives in the dungeon, showed signs of malnutrition, developmental delays, and physical ailments related to their years of captivity. The medical reports were crucial in establishing the conditions under which they had been forced to live, and they corroborated Elizabeth's account of the pregnancies and births that had taken place without any medical assistance. Another critical piece of the investigation was the analysis of Josef Fritzl's behavior and how he had managed to deceive not only his family but also the community and authorities for so long. Investigators dug into his background, uncovering a history of manipulation and control that spanned decades. It became clear that Fritzl was a master at presenting a public facade while concealing the truth. His ability to fabricate convincing stories, combined with his engineering skills, had allowed him to construct and maintain a prison right under the noses of those closest to him. In addition to the dungeon and the letters, authorities also examined the social services records related to the children who had been taken upstairs to live with Joseph and Rosemary. These children had grown up in relative normalcy compared to their siblings in the dungeon, and their presence in the Fritzl household had been explained through the same fabricated letters. Social workers had visited the family several times over the years but had never noticed anything unusual. The investigation revealed how Fritzl had used these letters to deceive not only his family but also the state, convincing them that he was a concerned grandfather who had stepped in to care for his abandoned grandchildren. As the evidence mounted, the true scale of Josef Fritzl's crimes became clear. The investigation revealed a man who had spent decades planning and executing one of the most horrific acts of imprisonment and abuse in modern history. Every detail, from the construction of the dungeon to the manipulation of his family and the authorities, was laid bare, and the investigators were left with the daunting task of preparing the case for trial. By the time the investigation concluded, authorities had amassed a mountain of evidence that painted a chilling portrait of Josef Fritzl's control, manipulation, and cruelty. The letters, the layout of the dungeon, the testimonies of Elisabeth and her children, and the forensic evidence all pointed to one undeniable truth. Josef Fritzl had built an entire world of abuse, and for 24 years he had succeeded in keeping that world hidden from everyone. But now that world had been exposed, and the full weight of the law was closing in on him. When the full details of Josef Fritzl's crimes were revealed, the public's reaction was one of overwhelming shock, disbelief, and outrage. Both locally in Amstetten and across the globe, the story of Elisabeth Fritzl's 24 years of captivity beneath her own family home sent shockwaves through communities and media outlets alike. People struggled to comprehend how such cruelty could have been carried out for so long, undetected and unchallenged, in what seemed like an ordinary family in a quiet, small town. In Austria, the revelations about the Fritzl case were met with a mix of horror and introspection. For the people of Amstetten, the town at the center of this unimaginable crime, the discovery that one of their own had committed such heinous acts was deeply unsettling. The house where Josef Fritzl had imprisoned his daughter and fathered 7 children with her became a symbol of hidden evil, and residents found it difficult to reconcile the image of the man they had known with the monster he truly was. Many neighbors expressed shock that such brutality had existed so close to their homes without anyone suspecting a thing. Locals in Amstetten felt betrayed. They couldn't understand how someone who had lived among them for so many years could have concealed such a dark secret. For decades, Josef Fritzl had maintained the appearance of a strict but respectable man, a family man, an engineer, a landlord, while perpetrating the most unimaginable crimes beneath the surface. The people of Amstetten were left grappling with guilt, asking themselves how they hadn't noticed the signs, how such a massive crime could go on unnoticed in their small town. But the impact of the Fritzl case wasn't confined to Austria. Globally, the media picked up the story, and within hours, it became a top headline across every major news outlet. The sheer inhumanity of the case captivated the world's attention, with people from all walks of life struggling to comprehend how such monstrous acts had been carried out, hidden behind the facade of normalcy for so long. Journalists descended on Amsterdam, turning the small town into a media epicenter, while news anchors and reporters relayed the story to audiences in every corner of the globe. The details of the case were so shocking that many people initially found it hard to believe. The idea that a father could imprison his own daughter for 2 decades, rape her repeatedly, and raise multiple children in a hidden dungeon beneath his home seemed like something out of a twisted horror story. But as more and more evidence came to light, it became clear that this nightmare was all too real. The global reaction was one of outrage as people grappled with the sheer depth of Joseph's depravity and the fact that he had maintained control over his daughter and her children for so long without anyone discovering the truth. What made the case even more horrifying was the duration of the abuse, the fact that it had lasted for 24 years. People were stunned that such a crime could go on for so long, completely unnoticed by Joseph's wife, Rosemary, the neighbors, and even social services. The idea that someone could lead a double life for such an extended period, hiding such a horrific secret, was almost too much to comprehend. The thought that Elisabeth Fritzl had been suffering in silence, right under the noses of her family and community, was devastating. Internationally, the Fritzl case became a symbol of the hidden dangers that can lurk behind even the most ordinary of facades. People across the world reacted with disbelief that such evil could be so carefully concealed. The media coverage was relentless, with every detail of the case picked apart, from the construction of the dungeon to the psychological trauma endured by Elisabeth and her children. News outlets from the United States to Europe, Asia, and Australia followed the case closely, with reporters and commentators expressing outrage over how such a profound abuse of human rights had occurred undetected for so long. The case also ignited a fierce debate about the failures of social services and the police. Many asked how such an elaborate scheme had managed to escape the attention of authorities. Social workers had visited the Fritzl home on multiple occasions to check on the children Joseph claimed were abandoned by Elisabeth, and yet none of them had ever noticed anything unusual. The letters Joseph forced Elisabeth to write, which explained the appearance of her children, were accepted without question, and the dungeon itself remained hidden despite the proximity to the rest of the household. For many, the Fritzl case became a wake up call about the dangers of blind trust and the assumptions people make about their neighbors and communities. The idea that such a horrific crime could happen in a small, quiet town in Austria, hidden behind the mask of a normal family, shattered people's sense of security. It forced a reckoning with the idea that monsters don't always look like monsters, that sometimes they hide in plain sight, maintaining the appearance of normalcy while committing unimaginable acts of cruelty. The public outrage also led to calls for reform. In Austria, the case prompted a review of social service practices and the way missing persons cases were handled. People demanded better oversight and more thorough investigations when it came to cases involving family abuse and domestic imprisonment. The global conversation expanded beyond the Fritzl case, raising awareness about similar cases of long-term captivity and abuse and urging governments to take action to prevent such tragedies from happening in the future. As the case continued to unfold, the public's fascination with the Josef Fritzl case remained intense. It became a topic of discussion in households, schools, and workplaces across the world. How had such a massive crime been hidden for so long? How could a father commit such heinous acts against his own daughter? And how could society prevent something like this from ever happening again? Ultimately, the Fritzl case became not just a story of unspeakable abuse, but also a reflection of society's vulnerabilities, of how evil can hide behind closed doors and how sometimes the darkest truths are the ones that remain hidden in plain sight for years. The world's reaction was one of collective horror as people struggled to come to terms with the depth of cruelty that had been exposed and the lessons that needed to be learned to prevent such horrors in the future. The psychological trauma endured by Elisabeth Fritzl and her children during their 24 years of captivity is both profound and complex. The long-term effects of their abuse, isolation, and imprisonment have left deep emotional scars that will take a lifetime to fully comprehend, let alone heal. After being freed from the dungeon, Elisabeth and her children were immediately placed under the care of psychological professionals who began the difficult task of assessing the toll that decades of confinement, manipulation, and abuse had taken on their mental health. For Elisabeth, the trauma ran especially deep. Having been imprisoned at the age of 18, Elisabeth had spent nearly half of her life in a dark, windowless dungeon, subjected to constant sexual, physical, and psychological abuse at the hands of her father. The extreme control Joseph had exerted over her, forcing her into submission through violence, threats, and deprivation, created a state of learned helplessness where Elizabeth's ability to resist or escape became psychologically impossible. Even when opportunities might have presented themselves, the weight of Joseph's dominance over her was so complete that her spirit and sense of agency had been crushed. Experts immediately recognized that Elizabeth's trauma extended beyond the abuse itself. The extreme isolation, lack of sunlight, and the complete separation from society for nearly a quarter of a century had fundamentally altered her perception of reality. She had been forced to give birth to 7 children in the most traumatic of circumstances, raising them in a confined space with little more than the barest essentials. The psychological toll of this experience was staggering. Elisabeth had been a prisoner not only of Joseph's physical control, but also of his emotional and mental manipulation, which had instilled in her a constant state of fear and dependency. The professionals working with Elizabeth after her rescue diagnosed her with complex post traumatic stress disorder (CPTSD), a severe form of PTSD that arises from prolonged and repeated trauma, especially in situations where the victim is under the control of the perpetrator. Elizabeth exhibited symptoms of hypervigilance, flashbacks, emotional numbing, and intense feelings of guilt. For years, Joseph had manipulated her into believing that her captivity was, in some twisted way, her fault, and that if she tried to resist or escape, her children's lives would be in danger. The impact of this trauma was not just emotional, it was deeply physiological as well. Decades of living in a constant state of fight or flight had taken a toll on Elizabeth's body. She experienced chronic anxiety, depression, and panic attacks, along with the physical effects of living in such poor conditions: malnutrition, a weakened immune system, and exhaustion. Even after being rescued, the fear of Joseph's power over her lingered in her psyche, making recovery a slow and difficult process. For the children born in captivity, the psychological damage was equally profound but manifested in different ways. The 3 children who had been raised in the dungeon with Elizabeth had never known anything beyond the walls of their underground prison. They had never seen the sun, felt the wind on their faces, or experienced the simple joys of childhood. Their entire world had been confined to a series of small, dark rooms where their mother was their sole source of comfort and education. The children's development had been severely impacted by their isolation. They suffered from developmental delays, both cognitive and emotional. The lack of social interaction and the oppressive conditions in which they were raised left them with severe attachment issues and difficulty in understanding basic social norms. Psychologists working with the children noted that their sense of reality was deeply distorted. They had no concept of what the outside world was like and were unsure how to process the flood of new information and experiences that came with their sudden freedom. Like their mother, the children were diagnosed with PTSD, with symptoms including nightmares, flashbacks, and fear of strangers. They had been conditioned to live in constant fear of Joseph, who had controlled every aspect of their lives, from when they could eat to when they could play. The psychological professionals who worked with them emphasized that the children would need extensive and long-term therapy to help them adjust to the world outside the dungeon. The 3 children who had been taken upstairs and raised with Rosemary Fritzl experienced a different kind of trauma. Though they had lived outside the dungeon, they were still part of Joseph's manipulative narrative, and they grew up believing that their mother had abandoned them to join a cult. These children had been raised in what seemed like a normal household, but the emotional confusion they felt when the truth was revealed caused deep psychological scars. They had to come to terms with the fact that the man they had known as their grandfather was also their biological father and their mother's abuser. These children exhibited symptoms of identity confusion, guilt, and emotional detachment. They had been told lies about their origins for years and were now grappling with the trauma of learning that their lives had been built on a foundation of deception and abuse. For these children, the psychological trauma was less about isolation and more about the emotional betrayal and manipulation they had experienced at the hands of Joseph. The long-term effects of the trauma experienced by Elizabeth and her children will likely last a lifetime. Experts have noted that the process of recovery will be slow, requiring years of therapy and support to help them reintegrate into society. The children, especially, will face challenges in developing healthy relationships, understanding trust, and overcoming the deep-seated fears instilled in them by Joseph. One of the most significant aspects of their recovery has been their relocation to a secure, undisclosed location where they are shielded from the intense media attention that followed the case. In this safe environment, Elizabeth and her children have been able to begin the process of healing away from the public eye, surrounded by professionals who understand the complexity of their trauma. Despite the unimaginable suffering they endured, Elizabeth and her children have shown incredible resilience. The road to recovery will be long, and the scars left by their years in captivity will never fully fade. However, with the help of ongoing psychological support and therapy, they have begun to rebuild their lives, learning to live in a world beyond the dungeon that once confined them. The Josef Fritzl case serves as a sobering reminder of the profound impact that long term captivity and abuse can have on the human psyche. It highlights the importance of ongoing psychological care and support for survivors of trauma, while also offering a glimpse into the incredible strength it takes to rebuild a life after experiencing such unimaginable horrors. The legal proceedings leading to Josef Fritzl's trial were a crucial moment in the search for justice for Elisabeth Fritzl and her children. After the truth of his crimes had been fully uncovered, there was no doubt that Fritzl would face a monumental reckoning for his decades of abuse and imprisonment. The trial, which took place in March 2009, was one of the most significant and highly publicized legal cases in Austrian history, drawing international attention and symbolizing the fight for justice for victims of long-term abuse and captivity. Once Elizabeth's story had been revealed to the police, the Austrian authorities moved swiftly to charge Josef Fritzl with a litany of crimes that reflected the depth and gravity of his actions. The charges against him were vast and covered the entirety of the 24 years of abuse and imprisonment that Elizabeth had suffered. Prosecutors sought to hold Fritzl accountable for every aspect of the horrific life he had forced on his daughter and the 7 children he had fathered with her. Fritzl faced several major charges, including rape. Fritzl was charged with the repeated and systematic rape of Elizabeth over the course of her imprisonment. She had been sexually assaulted countless times throughout the 2 decades she was held captive, and the fact that 7 children were born as a result of these assaults made this charge one of the most damning against him. Incest. The charge of incest was tied to the fact that Fritzl had fathered children with his own daughter, an act of profound violation and abuse. The children born in the dungeon, as well as those taken upstairs, were the direct result of Fritzl's sexual violence against Elizabeth. The incest charge carried significant weight in the trial as it underscored the monstrous nature of Fritzl's actions. Imprisonment and enslavement. One of the most critical charges was imprisonment, for which Fritzl was held accountable for keeping his daughter in the dungeon he had meticulously constructed. Elizabeth had been trapped there for 24 years, from the time she was 18 until her rescue in 2008. The charge also covered the imprisonment of her children, who had been born and raised in the same oppressive conditions without ever knowing the outside world. This charge reflected the total physical and psychological control that Fritzl had exercised over his victims. Manslaughter. Perhaps one of the most haunting charges Fritzl faced was for manslaughter. This charge was related to the death of one of Elizabeth's babies, a newborn boy who had died shortly after birth in 1996. According to Elizabeth's testimony, the baby had shown clear signs of distress. After being born, he struggled to breathe and appeared to be suffering from a severe respiratory problem. Despite this, Fritzl refused to provide any medical assistance. The child died after several days, and Fritzl disposed of the infant's body by burning it in an incinerator. The manslaughter charge highlighted not only the cruelty of Fritzl's refusal to seek help, but also the total disregard he had for the lives of his children. These were the core charges Fritzl faced, but the legal proceedings also addressed additional crimes such as coercion, deprivation of liberty, and assault. The prosecution aimed to paint a full picture of Josef Fritzl's horrific control over Elisabeth, as well as the sheer level of premeditation involved in the creation of the dungeon and the years of abuse. Fritzl initially attempted to downplay the extent of his crimes during the investigation and early stages of the trial. He tried to argue that he had provided for the children financially, claiming that he had given them food and supplies and that this somehow mitigated the abuse they had suffered. However, these weak defenses were quickly dismantled by the overwhelming evidence against him, including the dungeon itself, Elisabeth's testimony, and the medical and psychological assessments of the victims. During the trial, Elisabeth Fritzl did not appear in person, but her testimony was pivotal. Her account of the years she had spent in the dungeon, the repeated rapes, the births of her children, and the horrifying conditions they had endured painted a picture of unspeakable suffering. Elizabeth's testimony was recorded and played for the court, and the sheer emotional weight of her words left no doubt about the extent of Joseph's crimes. One of the most critical moments of the trial occurred when Josef Fritzl himself appeared before the court. His demeanor was largely emotionless, detached from the horrifying reality of the crimes he had committed. While Fritzl admitted to many of the charges, including rape, incest, and imprisonment, his attempts to justify his actions only deepened the public's outrage. He claimed that he had acted to protect Elizabeth by keeping her in the dungeon, a statement that was swiftly rejected by both the court and the public as the delusional reasoning of a man trying to justify the unjustifiable. The manslaughter charge proved to be one of the most damning against Fritzl, as it highlighted not just his cruelty but his willingness to allow an innocent child to die under his watch. The court heard how Fritzl had refused to seek medical help for the newborn even as the baby struggled to survive. The decision to incinerate the infant's body further illustrated the complete dehumanization that Fritzl had imposed on his own children. The court also heard from medical and psychological experts who detailed the long-term impact of the abuse on Elizabeth and her children. Their testimonies reinforced the systematic nature of Fritzl's control, showing how deeply he had manipulated and traumatized his victims, leaving them with severe physical and emotional scars. In March 2009, Josef Fritzl was found guilty on all charges. The verdict was swift and unanimous, with the court sentencing him to life imprisonment. He was to serve his sentence in a psychiatric prison, reflecting not only the heinous nature of his crimes, but also the psychological assessment that he posed a continuing danger to society. For Elisabeth Fritzl, the trial was a moment of justice. After years of suffering in silence, she had finally seen her abuser held accountable for his actions. But while the trial provided a sense of closure, it was clear that the psychological wounds inflicted on Elizabeth and her children would take far longer to heal. The Josef Fritzl trial stands as a powerful example of the legal system confronting one of the most horrific cases of abuse and captivity in modern history. It was a moment of reckoning for Josef Fritzl, but also a reminder of the incredible strength and resilience of Elisabeth Fritzl, who, against all odds, survived 24 years of horror and fought for justice, not just for herself, but for her children as well. During the trial, Josef Fritzl attempted to construct a defense that, while admitting to the central facts of his crimes, sought to mitigate his responsibility by casting his actions in a twisted light. His defense strategy revolved around the idea that he had not been a purely malevolent figure, but instead a man who, in his mind, had provided for his imprisoned daughter Elizabeth and their children. Fritzl's arguments were deeply disturbing and morally warped, reflecting the same control and manipulation he had exercised over his victims for decades. From the start of the trial, Fritzl admitted to many of the core accusations against him, including rape, incest, and the imprisonment of Elizabeth. These admissions were unavoidable given the overwhelming evidence, including Elizabeth's testimony, the physical evidence from the dungeon, and the accounts of medical and psychological experts. However, Fritzl's defense was not centered on outright denial. Instead, it focused on minimizing the severity of his crimes by framing himself as a provider and protector, claiming he provided for the family. Fritzl repeatedly emphasized that despite imprisoning his daughter and keeping her captive for 24 years, he had taken care of her and the children. He pointed out that he brought food, water, and basic supplies to the dungeon regularly, even adding additional rooms as the children were born to make their living situation more comfortable. In his view, this was evidence that he had not been a completely callous figure, but rather someone who fulfilled his duties as a father and provider in his own warped way. He framed himself as the sole provider for his underground family, stressing that he had built and maintained the dungeon to ensure their survival. Joseph tried to claim that he had done all this out of a twisted sense of duty to Elisabeth and the children, painting himself as a man who believed he was still helping them by ensuring they had enough food and necessities to live. While the court heard these arguments, they were viewed with deep skepticism. Fritzl's assertion that he had taken care of his family was undercut by the horrifying conditions in which Elisabeth and the children were forced to live, confined to cramped, windowless rooms with minimal access to the outside world, deprived of fresh air and sunlight, and completely isolated from society. The psychological toll of such conditions could never be justified by the provision of basic food and shelter, and his defense failed to acknowledge the abuse, neglect, and trauma his actions caused, justifying the captivity as a protective measure. Perhaps one of the most grotesque aspects of Fritzl's defense was his claim that keeping Elisabeth locked in the dungeon was an act of protection. He told the court that he had originally imprisoned her to protect her from bad influences, arguing that she had been rebellious in her teenage years and he had feared that she would get involved in drugs or other dangerous activities. By locking her away, he claimed he was saving her from a worse fate in the outside world. This line of defense was not only an attempt to mitigate the blame, but also a reflection of the deep narcissism and control that had characterized Fritzl's behavior for decades. He attempted to portray himself as a paternal figure who had acted in what he believed was Elizabeth's best interest, despite the fact that he had subjected her to unspeakable physical, sexual, and psychological abuse. This argument was quickly rejected by the court, as it was clear that his protection was nothing more than a means of maintaining absolute control over his daughter and creating a secret world where he could abuse her without consequence. Partial admission of guilt. Fritzl did admit to some aspects of his crime without attempting to justify them. He acknowledged the rapes and admitted to having fathered 7 children with Elisabeth during her captivity. However, he showed little genuine remorse during the trial. While he accepted these charges, his tone was often detached, as though he were describing a set of actions that had occurred in a vacuum, devoid of the profound suffering they had caused. He described the sexual assaults in a disturbingly matter-of-fact way, acknowledging that he had raped Elizabeth repeatedly, but framing these acts as part of the life they had built together in the dungeon. He continued to downplay the severity of his crimes, refusing to acknowledge the full weight of the trauma he had inflicted on both Elizabeth and their children. Denial of manslaughter responsibility. One of the few charges Fritzl contested was the manslaughter charge related to the death of the newborn child in 1996. He denied being directly responsible for the infant's death, despite Elizabeth's testimony that the baby had struggled to breathe after birth and Fritzl had refused to seek medical help. In Elizabeth's account, the baby had shown clear signs of distress, but Fritzl had dismissed her pleas and left the child to die. When the child eventually succumbed, Fritzl disposed of the body by burning it in an incinerator. Fritzl's defense on this point was that he hadn't intentionally killed the child. He claimed that he hadn't known the newborn was in such critical condition. This defense, however, did little to sway the court. The evidence, including Elizabeth's detailed account, painted a clear picture of criminal neglect that had directly led to the baby's death. Lack of genuine remorse. One of the most striking aspects of Fritzl's defense was his complete lack of remorse. Although he admitted to many of the crimes, his tone was cold and emotionless, and he made little effort to acknowledge the pain and suffering he had caused. His statements were mechanical, focusing on his role as a provider rather than reflecting any real sense of guilt or shame. This lack of empathy was noted by both the prosecution and the public, further solidifying the perception of Fritzl as a man driven by power, control, and a profound disregard for the humanity of his victims. Rejection of the defense by the court. Fritzl's defense, rooted in claims of provision and protection, was swiftly rejected by the court. The judge and jury saw through his attempts to justify his actions as acts of care or concern, recognizing them for what they truly were: systematic and sadistic acts of domination and control. The defense team's strategy did little to lessen the severity of the charges against Fritzl, and ultimately his arguments only reinforced the view that he was a manipulative and dangerous individual. The court found Fritzl guilty of all charges, including rape, incest, imprisonment, coercion, and manslaughter. His attempt to present himself as a provider and protector was not only ineffective but offensive to the justice system and the victims whose lives he had irreparably damaged. In the end, Josef Fritzl was sentenced to life imprisonment, and his attempts to mitigate his responsibility were seen as nothing more than another layer of the manipulation he had employed for decades to justify the horrors he inflicted on his own family. His defense crumbled under the weight of the overwhelming evidence against him, and justice was served for Elisabeth and her children. In March 2009, Josef Fritzl was found guilty of all charges in a trial that shocked not only Austria but the entire world. The charges against him included rape, incest, imprisonment, coercion, and manslaughter, each one reflecting the profound cruelty he had inflicted on his daughter Elisabeth and their children for more than 2 decades. After a trial that exposed the depths of his crimes, Fritzl's fate was sealed when the court handed down the maximum punishment: life imprisonment. The sentencing was the culmination of a trial that had laid bare the horrifying details of the 24 years of imprisonment, abuse, and psychological torment that Elisabeth had endured in the secret dungeon beneath the Fritzl family home. The evidence presented during the trial, from the testimonies of Elisabeth and her children to the detailed forensic reports on the conditions inside the dungeon, painted a vivid picture of systematic abuse that left no doubt about Fritzl's guilt. The judge presiding over the case condemned Fritzl's actions as some of the most heinous crimes ever committed, noting the calculated and premeditated nature of his abuse. Fritzl's meticulous construction of the dungeon, his repeated sexual assaults, and the psychological manipulation he used to maintain control over Elisabeth and her children were key factors in determining the severity of his sentence. In addition to the life sentence, the court ruled that Josef Fritzl would serve his time in a psychiatric institution based on the findings of psychological evaluations conducted during the trial. These evaluations determined that Fritzl exhibited narcissistic personality traits and a profound lack of empathy, making him a continuing threat to society. The decision to confine him to a psychiatric facility reflected the court's belief that Fritzl's actions were driven not only by a desire for control and dominance, but by deeper psychological issues that required long-term treatment. The sentencing marked the end of a legal saga that had gripped the world, but it also served as a moment of justice for Elisabeth and her children. Josef Fritzl's imprisonment meant that he would never again have the power to harm them or anyone else, and it closed the chapter on the 24 years of hell he had created beneath his own home. For Elisabeth, the court's decision was a crucial step in her journey toward healing, though the scars of the past would remain. In the wake of Josef Fritzl's sentencing, the priority shifted to ensuring that Elisabeth and her children could rebuild their lives in peace and security. The years they had spent in captivity had inflicted deep physical and psychological trauma, but now, for the first time in over 2 decades, they were free to start a new life, a life without fear, without control, and without the constant presence of Josef Fritzl looming over them. To protect Elizabeth and her children from the intense media scrutiny surrounding the case, the Austrian government took immediate steps to secure their safety and anonymity. New identities were provided to Elizabeth and her six surviving children, allowing them to live without the constant reminder of the horrors they had endured. The family was relocated to a secure, undisclosed location far from the town of Amstetten, where the events of their captivity had taken place. The family was moved to a specialized recovery facility in the Austrian countryside, where they could receive the medical, psychological, and emotional support they desperately needed. The facility was designed to provide a safe, nurturing environment away from the prying eyes of the media, allowing Elizabeth and her children to begin the slow process of healing. The psychological toll of their captivity was immense, and they were immediately placed under the care of therapists, psychologists, and medical professionals who specialized in trauma recovery. Elizabeth, who had spent nearly half of her life in captivity, faced the overwhelming challenge of re-entering a world that had changed drastically since she had been imprisoned at the age of 18. The transition was incredibly difficult. She had to adjust to a new world filled with unfamiliar technology, social norms, and the simple freedoms that most people take for granted. For Elizabeth, even the smallest aspects of daily life, like going outside, interacting with others, and making decisions for herself, were daunting after years of being controlled by her father. Her children, too, faced immense challenges. The three children who had been born and raised in the dungeon had never known anything beyond its walls. They had never seen sunlight, experienced fresh air, or interacted with anyone other than their mother and Joseph. These children suffered from developmental delays, psychological trauma, and severe social anxiety. They needed intensive therapy to help them adjust to the outside world, learn basic social skills, and overcome the emotional scars left by their years in captivity. The three children who had been raised upstairs by Josef and Rosemary Fritzl had a different set of challenges. Although they had lived outside the dungeon, they had been raised under the false belief that their mother had abandoned them to join a cult. Learning the truth that Joseph was both their father and the abuser who had kept their mother and siblings imprisoned was a traumatic revelation. These children grappled with feelings of betrayal, confusion, and guilt as they tried to come to terms with the reality of their family history. Despite the overwhelming challenges they faced, Elizabeth proved to be an incredibly resilient figure. She became the pillar of strength for her children, guiding them through the recovery process and helping them adjust to their new lives. In the years following their rescue, Elizabeth worked closely with therapists to address her own trauma, while also ensuring that her children received the care and support they needed. The family's recovery has been slow but steady. They have managed to remain out of the public eye, thanks to the efforts of Austrian authorities to protect their privacy and provide them with a peaceful environment in which to rebuild their lives. Over time, Elizabeth and her children have started to reconnect with the world around them, slowly reclaiming their sense of independence and control over their futures. For Elizabeth, the process of rebuilding her life has also involved reconnecting with the family she had been separated from for so long. Her mother, Rosemary Fritzl, was devastated by the revelation of Joseph's crimes and struggled with feelings of guilt for not knowing what had been happening in her own home. Elizabeth's relationship with her mother has been complex, but there have been efforts toward reconciliation as both women come to terms with the trauma inflicted by Joseph. The Fritzl case remains a symbol of both the horrors of captivity and the strength of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable adversity. While the journey toward healing for Elizabeth and her children will be a lifelong process, their survival and resilience are a testament to their inner strength. With their new identities and the support of dedicated professionals, they have been given a second chance at life, a chance to live free from fear and to reclaim the years that were stolen from them. The Josef Fritzl case sent shockwaves through Austria and across the world, not only because of its horror, but because of how such a crime had gone undetected for over 2 decades. The revelations forced society and lawmakers to confront the failures in the systems designed to protect vulnerable individuals. As the details of the case emerged, it became clear that the legal and social frameworks in place were insufficient to prevent such heinous acts, prompting sweeping changes in how authorities approach cases of familial abuse, missing persons, and underground imprisonments. One of the most significant impacts of the Fritzl case was the heightened scrutiny of familial abuse. The public was forced to acknowledge that such abuse can take place within the most seemingly ordinary families, and that perpetrators often rely on their trusted status to conceal their crimes. The Fritzl case served as a painful reminder that abusers can exist in any household and that the power dynamics within families can make it incredibly difficult for victims to escape. This case galvanized public awareness, encouraging more people to report suspicious behavior and engage with local authorities when they sensed that something might be wrong behind closed doors. The investigation also revealed significant gaps in how missing persons cases were handled. Elizabeth's disappearance had been written off by the authorities after Joseph produced fabricated letters claiming she had joined a cult. The failure to investigate her disappearance more thoroughly highlighted the need for authorities to be more critical of parental explanations and to dig deeper, especially in cases where vulnerable young people are involved. In the wake of the Fritzl case, Austria and other countries implemented reforms aimed at improving the investigation of missing persons cases, ensuring that such cases are not closed prematurely without thorough inquiry. Additionally, the Fritzl case raised the alarming possibility of underground imprisonments previously considered rare. In response, authorities in Austria began conducting more thorough inspections of homes, especially when there were suspicions of abuse or neglect. Social services and police departments were urged to work more closely together, with updated protocols to investigate homes where something seemed amiss. This case underscored the importance of cooperation between various agencies, law enforcement, child protective services, and medical professionals to spot red flags and take decisive action before abuse escalates. Globally, the Fritzl case became a symbol of the hidden dangers that can exist in the shadows of everyday life. It served as a reminder that systematic abuse can thrive in secrecy, often overlooked by those closest to the victims. The case prompted countries around the world to re-examine their laws regarding domestic violence, child protection, and missing persons investigations, leading to a strengthening of laws designed to protect the vulnerable from exploitation and captivity. The Josef Fritzl case remains one of the darkest and most haunting examples of familial abuse and captivity in modern history. It exposed the horrifying reality that even the most unimaginable crimes can be hidden behind the facade of normality for years, shielded by the very structures of family and community that are meant to protect us. The case demonstrated how power, control, and manipulation could be used to imprison not just the body but the mind, and how an individual could live a double life, deceiving everyone around them. The legacy of the Fritzl case is both a warning and a call to action. It reminds us of the importance of vigilance and the need to confront difficult truths, especially when it comes to abuse within the family. It forces us to question the trust we place in authority figures, particularly when that trust can be weaponized to conceal monstrous behavior. It also shines a light on the importance of supporting survivors, providing them with the care and resources they need to rebuild their lives after enduring unimaginable trauma. The lessons from the Fritzl case go beyond the specifics of his crime. They serve as a rallying cry for societal responsibility. We must ensure that systems of protection are robust, that social services, law enforcement, and the legal system work in concert to detect signs of abuse, and that we never overlook potential red flags. The tragic failure in Elisabeth Fritzl's case was not just her father's monstrous actions, but the collective failure of those who could have intervened earlier. In the end, the Josef Fritzl case stands as a stark reminder of the potential for evil to thrive in secrecy and the lengths to which abusers will go to maintain control. It teaches us that we must remain vigilant, empathetic, and committed to the protection of the vulnerable in our society. We must use the lessons of this case to build a future where such horrors cannot happen again. If we take away anything from this horrifying case, it's that silence enables abuse. By raising awareness, supporting victims, and strengthening laws, we can take meaningful steps toward ensuring that no one endures the kind of nightmare that Elisabeth Fritzl and her children did. Now is the time to take action, to look closer, to speak out, and to help those who may be suffering in silence. We must be the voice for the voiceless and prevent these hidden horrors from ever taking root again. If you or someone you know is experiencing abuse or captivity, reach out to local authorities or seek help from organizations dedicated to supporting survivors. Together, we can build a safer, more vigilant society. This is not just a story of unimaginable horror, it's a reminder of the hidden dangers that can exist behind closed doors. But it's also a call to action. If you see something, say something. If you or someone you know is in danger, don't stay silent. Reach out, seek help, and be the voice that breaks the silence. Together, we can make sure that tragedies like the Josef Fritzl case never happen again. Let's build a world where every life is valued, every voice is heard, and every hidden story is brought to light. Stay vigilant, stay compassionate, and always remember speaking out can save lives.